Yeah. And so Michael Jackson essentially is accused or indicted with one count of essentially imprisoning this family on Neverland Ranch. Um, Now, it's been a fairly long time. It's been about 21 years. But I do remember that conspiracy charge sort of backfired in court, right? I mean, it became one of the primary reasons why the prosecution's case collapsed. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, yeah, because huge amounts of it were positively proven to be fictitious. So the family were claiming that they had been held prisoner at the ranch against their will. They were claiming that they had repeatedly escaped from the ranch and then been dragged back by Michael Jackson's henchmen. They're claiming that they weren't allowed to speak to outsiders. They were banned from using the phone. They couldn't go anywhere. They were claiming at one point even that the conspiracy was so elaborate that they wanted to completely disorient the family and they wouldn't even allow them to see calendars or clocks because they wanted them to be so disoriented in time. I mean, just bizarre. So huge amounts of this are proved beyond any reasonable doubt to be just untrue. So during their supposed period of captivity, they leave the ranch repeatedly. Twice they go home and then come back. But also they go to a dentist appointment, they go to a hospital appointment, they go to a meeting with a lawyer because Janet is at that time planning or considering suing Martin Bashir for the inclusion of her kids in his show because she says she never signed a release form. So Janet goes for body waxes during this period. She and her children go out shopping for luggage and clothes for a trip to Brazil because part of the conspiracy charge was that Michael Jackson was supposedly planning to traffic the family against their will out of the country and to Brazil to hide them from the media. Just so much of this. So they bring in witnesses who testify. Janet Arvizo was excited. She told us, I can't wait to go to Brazil. And she was asking us, do you want to come with us? It's going to be an amazing trip. You know, one of the most spectacular ways in which the conspiracy charge blew up in the prosecutors' faces was actually instigated by the prosecution. It was so bizarre. So Janet Arvizo has just come on the stand. I think it's her first day of testimony. And she testifies about the first time she escapes from the ranch. And she says, we were being held there against our will. We weren't allowed to leave. And under the cover of darkness, I found an employee there whose name was Jesus Salas. He's Hispanic like us. I said to him, can you help us? We need to get off of this ranch. And he agreed to sneak us off the ranch. He put us in a car and he drove us home, right? So then the prosecutor, Ron Zonen, says, at this moment, I would like to play the tape recording. Now, in the transcript, there is no transcript of the tape recording. So when you read a trial transcript, at the moment where a video or a tape is played, it just says, whereupon a portion of exhibit XYZ was played. And then it comes back to the testimony, right? I managed to gain access to this tape recording, to the exhibit that Ron Zonen had played. And so I listened to it. It's a tape recording which was made the following morning of a phone call between Michael's personal assistant, Frank Cassio, and Janet Arvizo. At this time, the Michael Jackson organization is documenting every interaction they have with the Arvizos because of the warning that they've received from Chris Tucker. So in the morning, Frank Cassio wakes up. The Arvizos have vanished from the ranch, and he rings Janet Arvizo at her home, and the recording, the call was tape recorded. So in this in this tape recording, which is less than 24 hours after she leaves the ranch, Frank says, I woke up this morning, you were gone, what happened? And Janet Arvizo says, oh, Frank, you're not going to believe this, right? I was on the ranch yesterday minding my own business, and the Germans came up to me, the Germans being Michael's managers, Dieter Weisner and Ronald Konitzer, and they said, Janet, you've been at the ranch long enough. The furore over this documentary has died down. Nobody's camping outside your house anymore. Your kids are missing school. you need to go back to your normal life. It's time for you to go home. And I said, how dare you? We can never go back to our normal life. You know, our life is over now because of this. We need to stay here. And they said, no, you know, you've been here for quite a while now. It's time for you to leave. You need to go home. And I was so furious that I went and found Jesus Salas and I said, if they want us off the ranch, then we'll leave. and then they're having this discussion and Frank's like, oh, okay. And she's saying, and I was so looking forward to that trip to Brazil. And Frank says, well, you can still go to Brazil if you want. And they're having this whole conversation about, you know, oh, it's going to be so wonderful. We can dance under the moonlight and do the salsa. And then she starts saying, you know, these Germans, they're trying to come between me and Michael. They're trying to separate me from Michael. Michael is the father to my children now. Michael, we are a family now. His family is our family and our family is his family. And these Germans, they're just trying to come between us and they're trying to kick us off the ranch. And I'm listening to this tape, which is literally the exact opposite of what Janet had just testified to under oath. She's just testified I was being held against my will and I had to escape. And now we're listening to an unguarded, secretly recorded conversation with her less than 24 hours after it happened, where she says, I wanted to stay and they kicked me out, right? Why did Ron Zonen play? I've never understood why Ron Zonen played that tape. It's kind of mad. It's just a completely demented thing to do as a prosecutor. The only conclusion I can draw is that he knew it was bad and he knew the defense would play it. So he thought maybe if I play it, it will trick the jury into thinking it's good for the prosecution rather than bad. I don't know. But I mean, it was, in my opinion, it's one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the whole trial, because this is not a bunch of defense witnesses coming in and testifying to impeach Janet Arvizo. This is Janet Arvizo impeaching Janet Arvizo. We are listening to Janet Arvizo in her own words at the time, telling the jury that what she's just testified to under oath was a lie, was not true. So this conspiracy charge just fell to pieces like a wet cake. It was a disaster. Almost every element of the conspiracy charge, from the, we were being held against our will, we weren't allowed to look at clocks, we weren't allowed to speak to people on the phone, we weren't allowed to meet anyone, it all was positively proven to be not true. So what you're left with, and when I interviewed the jury foreman, whose name was Paul Rodriguez, he said that one thing that the jurors all agreed on when they got into their deliberations, they realized there was something they were all agreed on, which was before the defense had even begun their case, by the time the prosecution had finished their case, they were all sure, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Arvizos were lying about the conspiracy. So what you're left with in that instance is some molestation charges for which the only evidence is the testimony of two witnesses who you know have lied to you about every other element of their story. So how can you possibly convict Michael Jackson based on the word of Gavin Arvizo and Star Arvizo when it has been proved to you beyond any reasonable doubt that this whole other story they've told you about being kidnapped and held hostage and we weren't allowed to look at clocks and we weren't allowed to look and speak to anyone, it was all just fake. It was all just a lie. So,
but on those, I mean, I take that point, but I mean, on those molestation allegations, the testimony of the two accusers, or the two brothers, Gavin Arvizo, who is the alleged victim, and Star Arvizo, who is a witness to some of these acts, was also found to be questionable. Let's put it this way, right? Now, there are a couple of things that I remember. One is the grandma Michael Jackson masturbation story. Can you please tell me that? Because that sort of torched the case a bit. No, and not a bit. I mean, that torched the case from what I remember. Was it I don't know if it was as significant as I remember it being, but perhaps you can shed some light on that.
It was one of a number of significant moments of impeachment during the boys' testimony. So Gavin Arvizo tells the jury Michael Jackson told me that you have to masturbate because if you don't, you can become so sexually pent up that you'll rape somebody. When Tom Mesereau was sat there listening to this testimony during direct examination, it rang a bell with him, and he started looking through the paperwork. And he realized that when Gavin was interviewed by the police had asked him various questions about does he know what sex is and does he know what masturbation is. And he tells the police, I know what masturbation is because my grandmother told me. She told me that if I didn't masturbate, I could become so sexually pent up that I would rape somebody. So he seems in his courtroom evidence to have transposed the words of his grandmother into the mouth of Michael Jackson. But also, there was
But yeah, well, I
there
mean,
was
it's stunning. It's stunningly unlikely that they would say the exact same thing. You know, especially something as far fetched as this. I mean,
and it's covered in the Netflix show, and Diane Dimond sort of tries to make out like this is some kind of chicanery by the defense, and like, well, clearly Michael Jackson and the grandmother both said it, but I mean that's just so unlikely.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of problems. So, for example, in the original version of the story, Gavin told the police he'd been molested 5 or 6 times. By the time it comes to court, he's saying it's 1 or 2 times. When I interviewed the jury foreman, Paul Rodriguez, he said that caused the jury quite a substantial problem because they were like, firstly, what kind of kid doesn't know the difference between being molested 1 and 6 times? And even when you're saying 1 or 2 times, I mean, you would know if it happened more than once, right? So he found that discrediting. There was the fact that the brother, who was supposedly an eyewitness, had wildly changed his story about what he actually saw. So he had, on one occasion, described seeing Michael Jackson and his brother laying in a spoon's position with Michael kind of rubbing against his brother. And then by the time he comes to court, they're lying side by side with Michael's hand in the boy's underwear. Also, the story had changed as to whether his brother was wearing pajamas or underwear. That had changed. So there were quite substantial inconsistencies in the accounts. But also, when I spoke to Paul Rodriguez, he said, what you get from the transcript is the words, but what you don't get from the transcript is the body language. So Paul Rodriguez was a retired school counselor, and he said to me, I know when a kid is lying to me, and I could see it. And also he said what you didn't get from the transcript was Mesereau had a very clever way of questioning the boys in particular. So the way he explained it to me was, he said, when people learn a story, they tend to learn the story from start to finish. And so if you question somebody out of order, it becomes very difficult for them to keep track of the story they're supposed to be telling. He said, if you live through something, it's not a problem. If you genuinely experience something, people can ask you all sorts of questions about it, and you can just answer them. But if you're trying to memorize a story, it becomes very difficult if you break it up. So when he was cross-examining both of the boys, he kept jumping backwards and forwards in the chronology to different parts of the story. And they started to completely lose the plot. So by the time Star Arvizo had finished his testimony, he was back to the version of the story that Michael was originally indicted on, where the molestation happened on the earlier dates, for which Michael had an alibi. So by the time he'd finished his testimony, he had regressed back to the first version of the story, which was the story that was demonstrably not true. But Paul Rodriguez said it was the way that the witnesses were looking at the prosecution in an almost pleading way. Like Tom Mesereau would be asking them questions, and they would be looking at the prosecutors as if to say, what am I supposed to say? I can't remember what I'm supposed to say. So you only get so much from a transcript, and that's what a jury is there for. I sit in court every week, and when you sit in a trial, the judge will tell the jury, sometimes they'll say, don't take too many notes, because this case is about what the witnesses say, but it's also about how they say it. You are here as a jury to bring your collective common sense and world experience to the case, and you need to be looking at these witnesses and assessing whether you believe they're telling you the truth. And that was what Paul Rodriguez said. He said, from the transcript, you get all the discrepancies, but from being in court, you got the body language, and that was what persuaded him that these complainants were not credible.
Of course, Gavin Arvizo also, if I'm not wrong, says that, he was questioned about an interview he'd had with, I suppose, the headmaster or the principal of his school, to whom he'd said that no molestation had happened. That also happened, am I right?
That was Jeffrey Alpert. Yeah, and by the way, the lady who said that Janet rang her and said, if you want to contact me, go through my attorney, Larry Feldman, that was Mary Holzer. I've just remembered her name. So Jeffrey Alpert and Mary Holzer were two witnesses who came forward after the trial had already started. They saw the trial on the news and were like, hang on a minute, I know something about this. So Jeffrey Alpert, he was a teacher at the Hollywood High School, which is right near the Walk of Fame and opposite Mel's Drive-In, I think it's called. So he recalled vividly having a discussion with Gavin Arvizo and with his mother, where he said, look, did anything happen to you? Because he was getting picked on in school about the Bashir documentary. And he was like, look, did anything happen? Gavin was like, no, it didn't. Then he spoke to Janet, and he said Janet was absolutely rhapsodizing about Michael is just amazing. You know, he's looked after us. Nothing inappropriate has ever happened. And he was able to peg it to spring break. He said, obviously, I didn't take a contemporaneous note of exactly what date this happened on, but I remember it happened, and he gave a proximity to spring break. And essentially, it was possible to determine from the date that he gave that this all happened after they had left the ranch for the last time. So it's after the alleged, this is another instance of the conspiracy charge falling apart. So this whole discussion with Jeffrey Alpert happens after Janet is now saying she'd been held against her will at the ranch, she'd been prevented from talking to people, she'd not been allowed to talk to anyone. But here she is telling the school teacher, Michael is wonderful, he's been great to us, you know, we're great friends with him. So that was another knife in the heart of the conspiracy charge, as well as the molestation.
Yeah, okay. So towards the end of this case, the prosecution tries to get permission to introduce something called prior bad acts evidence. Can you tell me a little bit about that, please, Charles?
Yeah, so that was actually precedent setting. So there had been for a while in California at that time a statute called 1108, which allowed you in these kind of cases to bring in evidence of uncharged prior similar allegations. However, what the judge did in this case had never ever been done before, which was that he allowed prior bad acts evidence to be brought in without the alleged victims testifying. So it brought in effectively a parade of paid tabloid informants who had received large amounts of money to come up with stories about Michael Jackson and kids, to repeat the stories that they'd sold to the media. But they were stories about kids who themselves were saying, I was never molested, this didn't happen. So that was unprecedented in California. It never ever happened before. So it was one of many examples of the judge basically throwing a life raft to the prosecution to try to bolster their case for them. But ultimately, it was a disaster. So it's one of those things. I was watching the Netflix documentary, and on several occasions, Diane Diamond says things like, but then what the prosecution did then, I thought was brilliant. Every time she said that, I just thought, well, it wasn't that brilliant, Diane, was it? Because they lost the case. So anyway, so they bring in these 1108 witnesses, and it was just a train wreck. It was an absolute train wreck because every single one of them had such catastrophic credibility issues. So with many of them, they had actually been asked, did you ever see anything inappropriate with Michael Jackson and kids? And they said no. But then somebody would knock on the door and say, I've got $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 for you if you're prepared to say you saw Michael Jackson doing something inappropriate with a kid. And all of a sudden they changed their story. And what became clear was that there were certain media organizations that were effectively working in tandem with the prosecution. It was almost like a pincer movement. So the media would show up, a particular media organization would show up. They would offer money and say, if you're prepared to say you saw this, that, or the other, we'll give you 20,000, 50,000, whatever it was. Enormous sums were being offered. One family was offered 200,000 to say something. As soon as they said it, the story would come out in the paper or on TV, and immediately the police or the prosecutors would be on the doorstep saying, we've seen this story that you sold. And what they would do, it's so clever and so subtle, but they would sit down with their tape recorder and say, right, so just so you know, if this does come to court, all of this will have to be given to Michael Jackson in disclosure, because he will have a right to see it. His defense will have a right to see it. But anyway, so were you telling the truth to the media, or were you maliciously defaming Michael Jackson? So basically, it's like you're putting them between a rock and a hard place. Even if they have an attack of conscience, they can't now say, no, it was all lies. Because if they say it's all lies, this tape is going to be given to Michael Jackson's defense lawyer. And now he can sue the crap out of them, right? So it becomes a situation where they're effectively press ganged into becoming a prosecution witness. The media shows up and gives them the bag of cash, and then the prosecutors knock on the door and say, it'd be a terrible shame if we had to tell Michael Jackson that you admit to lying about this, wouldn't it? So they were effectively press ganged into becoming witnesses. And there were, I mean, for example, Blanca Francia, she ended up completely recanting on the stand. So she claimed that she'd seen Michael Jackson in the shower with a kid. And by the time she finished her evidence, after being cross-examined by Tom Mesereau, she was admitting that she never saw Michael Jackson in the shower with a kid. So she actually did recant. But others, I mean, one of them was...
Wait, hang on. Her son took to the stand during that case and said that he had been molested. Please do tell me about that. It forms a significant part of the Netflix documentary.
Yes, so Jason Francia, so I talked to you last time about the very aggressive way in which that the police officers were approaching children and telling them lies and shouting and swearing at them and saying, you're a liar, just admit that you were molested. Jason Francia was one of those kids. They showed up at his school and interviewed him in the absence of his mother or a lawyer. And they basically harassed him in a very aggressive way. This is according to Jason Francia himself. He said in a deposition or a statement, they kept making me come up with stuff that got to the point where I wanted to hit them in the head. He insists for a very long time, Michael Jackson never did anything inappropriate with me. He tells them he was very encouraging with my schoolwork. He would get me to read books. If I read a book and I was able to talk to him about the book, he would give me $10 or something. He was really kind to me. We would used to watch cartoons, and sometimes we would have a tickle contest. As the police just keep saying to him, "You're lying." They were swearing at him. They were shouting at him. They were saying, "You're lying." Then they were saying, he's molesting Macaulay Culkin right now. As we speak, he's molesting Macaulay Culkin, and it's your fault. If you don't tell us what he did to you, we can't save Macaulay Culkin, right? All this stuff. Eventually, he comes up with an account where he says, well, maybe a couple of times during the tickle contests, he might have brushed against my groin outside my clothing, right? That's the story that he comes up with at that point. Then his mother firstly sells a story to Hard Copy for $20,000, but then goes for a meeting with Larry Feldman. And after she goes for a meeting with Larry Feldman, now the son is saying, rather than saying Michael Jackson used to get me to read books, and if I read a book, he'd give me some money, he's now saying he used to grab me on the crotch, and then if I didn't say anything, he would stuff money down my underwear and all this kind of stuff, right? So, but what does this lead to? It leads to a $2 million payout from Michael Jackson's defense lawyers at the same time as or roughly the same time as the Chandler payout. So it's highly dubious, and is ultimately linked to a demand for millions of dollars.
But a successful demand in this case, right? And so if these people are lying, I mean, I think we discussed this maybe briefly last time, that the settlements actually do enable more of these sorts of allegations to come through. They open a Pandora's box.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But Michael is, as I say, he's in the situation he's in, whereby he's looking down the barrel of these people coming to a civil trial and him having to give his defense away in the civil trial before he can face any kind of criminal proceedings. So the settlements, although retrospectively you can look back and go, they were a bad decision, and ultimately they incentivized people to come forward with more allegations, they did have a sound legal basis at the time. There was a rational legal basis on which to pay those settlements.
Mm-hmm.